tentative title that I'm working now is E-commerce Firms Strategies Towards Institutional Failures, Evidence from Brazilian Favelas. And well, let's jump in. So I think the main motivation for this paper is that there is this burgeoning debate about global challenges, especially related to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I think many of the participants in the arts community work with the SDGs, and I think more and more, especially now after this crisis, we have concern if we are going to achieve those goals or not, right? And theoretically speaking, and at the same time, there is this discussion about institutional failures and how sometimes these institutional failures hamper the efficient market developments, right? So there is a huge literature in management and in institutional economics about it. And on the same time, we see combining these two streams, this increased interest on how firms or for-profit organizations might strategize to overcome some of those failures. And then you might be asking yourself, so what would be an example of an institutional failure? And then I'm bringing to you a tentative example here. So I'm Brazilian by background, and I think Brazilian favelas or urban slums, they are a good example of that. I actually have even a picture of mine in one of the institutional failure settings, right? There's a favela da Rocinha in Rio, and favelas are marked by lack of property rights definition, by lack of capital markets, legal systems, education systems. Usually they perform way worse than in other areas that are non-favelas, mainly because you don't have as much public investment, right? So we can somehow classify these areas as this potentially institutional failures that have voids to development of commercial institutions. But if you're not convinced that actually favelas have this gap on institutions, let me show you some data. So this comes from the Brazilian census. And as we can see, I have child mortality here, poverty, vulnerability, average income, and HDI that combines health, education, and income. And as we can see, favelas perform worse, substantially worse than the surrounding areas or the areas that are immediately adjacent to the favela, but also perform worse than the metropolitan area and also rural areas in the same state. So I think by now we can conclude that they have some sort of institutional failure or misalignment in those locations. And if you remember the third comment that I made on my initial slides, one of the main concerns now is how firms interact with these communities, and if they do so, if they can help to diminish this part of this failure, if they can overcome. And here I have a screenshot of a consumer complaint website in Brazil, right? And this particular consumer lives in Rio de Janeiro. And he or she is saying, well, firms discriminate against consumers because they live in communities. Communities is the politically correct word, let's say, for favelas. And in part of his speech, he says, like, if the company operates in my area, why don't they perform deliveries in my zip code? This is discrimination. They deliver to people who live near me outside of the favela, but they do not deliver to me only because my home is inside the favela. So we might have evidence here that firms are also fostering some sort of inequality because they do not potentially not treat consumers similarly. And this leads me to my research question, is precisely to understand if firms are doing so, and if they might do so or they might not do so, how they overcome this institutional failure. So this is a picture also from the same favela. As you can see, we have a visual like the disparity between the favelas and the surrounding. Right? So to analyze this to answer and analyze this research question, I developed a robot and I collect data, I scrape data from e-commerce firms operating in Brazil. So I have more than 400,000 e-commerce transactions for 11 different e-commerce firms, 21 different favelas and surroundings all over the country, so to avoid any regional bias. I have products ranging from 4 different categories, varying by size and value. I collect data systematically every week throughout 17 weeks. So I avoid also seasonalities and biases. And I collect distances from the zip code to the favela border that I will describe in a minute, and some farms characteristics that will help me to understand what are the drives for firm heterogeneity here. And the main information that I'm concerned and I collected is information about refused orders, delivery price, and delivery price ratios. So let me try to describe you how this data collection happened, okay? Let me drink some coffee as well. As a Brazilian, I could not get without it. so, uh, so this is, let's say, a e-commerce web page, right? And this is an advertisement for a sofa. So first, the bot collects information on which product are we dealing with. Then we collect the price of the product that is posted online. Keep in mind that this price is posted online and never changes, or if changes, it changes for every consumer that accesses this web page. Then, based on a list of zip codes for which I knew previously, the ones who were in favelas and the ones who were not in favelas, I input the zip code in the box, and then I collect information on the delivery price and then the delivery time, and also if the store or the firm is willing or not to do the transaction. Then basically what I do is I do a regression model with, controlling for fixed effects here to analyze whether the zip codes that are in favelas, they tend to be more often refuse their orders and delivery price ratios as well. As you can see in this table, there are like, on average, favelas are more likely to get their orders refused. In other words, the e-commerce firms simply do not complete the transaction, right? They block the transaction. And conditional on accepting the transaction, the favelas have a higher delivery fee and a higher delivery price ratio, right? So we are talking about 6% more often refusals, 18 reais more expensive to perform the delivery, what would be by that time around $5, $5. I went a step ahead and I collected data on the distance from each one of my zip codes to the favela border. So this is, again, Favela da Rocinha, the one that I shown in previous pictures. The pink shaded area is the favela area. You can see that there are other favelas nearby, but let's focus on this one. The pink shaded area is the favela area, and then I collect the linear distance from a zip code outside to the favela border, to the favela entrance, and similar to the zip codes that are inside. I did this manually to make sure that I was collecting data from the zip code to the favela entrance, avoiding to get like the shortest near distance, which might lead to a dead end. For instance, if I had a zip code here, it would get like possibly a distance to nowhere, right? And with this distance, I applied the regression discontinuity model to evaluate if there is any jump on the border of the favela. So the main assumption of an RDD is that at the limit, at the border, we will see no jump in the in the characteristics of both places. And as we are talking here about deliveries, I thought infrastructure would be a good way to test if this assumption holds. So as you can see here in this graph, I'm plotting the distance from and to the favela border. So 0 is the favela border. The negatives are in the surrounding zip codes. The positives are the favela zip codes. And as you can see in electrical power coverage, we what usually requires some installation roads to access the places. We have no jump in the near the cutoff. Similarly to garbage collection, that also relies on logistical infrastructure. And even waters and sewage coverage, we don't see necessarily a discontinuity, even though we see a bit of difference as farther inside you get in the favela. So based on this result, I conclude that, well, the RDD assumption holds. Let's see what we got as a result from our main DVs.
So 5 minutes, Leo.
Thank you, Frank. So as we can see, we see a discontinuity in terms of refused orders. So favela zip codes are more likely to get their transactions simply declined. And conditional on acceptance, we see this huge increase in delivery price and the delivery price ratio as long as you go further inside the favelas. So pausing now for a minute, what we can see is that, well, as expected by the institutional failure literature, indeed favelas have have a higher are higher charged by firms, right? Potentially because of those failures. But what was interesting in my analysis, at least from my point of view, is that there was heterogeneity across firms, and I went to look forward to understand what was this heterogeneity. And to do so, I did a field study. So I lived in a favela for a while, and I went to other favelas to interview people to figure out what were the potential mechanisms behind this result. So the first one was related to transaction costs. So potentially we have this this concept that, oh, in favelas you're going to have higher criminality, or the logistical difficulties will hamper the delivery of the products, right? And during the interviews with store managers in favelas, surprisingly, some of they said to me that, well, our store here has never been robbed, different from others in Rio, right? And indeed, I took those pictures during my visit there. We see some police officers, we see banks inside the favelas. How much these police officers are corrupt, I think, is another question. But anyway, it seems to be the case that not necessarily crime is driving the results. But on the other hand, some of them said that infrastructure challenges might hamper a bit a more efficient way to deliver goods. So transaction cost is one of the mechanisms. The second mechanism that I explored is the resources and capabilities, in particular because some of the e-commerce firms, they have physical stores either inside the favelas or in the outside, but in the nearby areas. And some of the consumers and even store managers that I interviewed there, they said, well, delivering is hard, but at least the clients can purchase online and come to the store and pick it up. Others, as a consumer, said like, wow, I bought some books and then I went outside the favela to this neighborhood that is a bit far away, and I went there and picked up my goods. So there is this mechanism in which I interpret stores as a potential complementary assets for the e-commerce activities. And last but not least, thank you, Frank. We have a potential stakeholder orientation of the firms in which they might deal differently with this low-income and disenfranchised consumers. So in the words of the store managers, this store manager in another favela, she said, well, our firm, they have this logic of dealing with low-income populations, and this is in the DNA of the company. So I tested after this qualitative assessment, I tested this in a more quantitative way, these three mechanisms. The first one using product characteristics related to the size and value of the product that would be correlated with the risk of robbery and logistical costs. For mechanism one. For mechanism two, I tested the fact that some of the e-commerce firms have physical stores, and some of them have physical stores inside favelas. And finally, a stakeholder orientation based on employees' ratings and consumer ratings of the firm. And my results show that it seems the MEC is kind of a combination between mechanism 2 and mechanism 3 that support the fact that some firms are more evenly charging consumers in and out favelas. So just to give you an overview, with the third mechanism, I got this information on how employees evaluate the firm, in particular here, the culture of the firm, right? And using this information, I repeat the same analysis, checking if firms that have higher scores in culture evaluated by their employees, if they charge differently the favelas consumers. And as we can see here, just in a visual illustration, firms that have higher cultural scores from the employees, they tend to refuse less offers, and they tend to charge lower prices than their competitors. We still see this a little bit of an increase here, but it's less. And the higher the culture, the more even the charge, and the more inclusive is the likelihood of working with this consumers. So to finish and conclude my talk, what I think what this study is showing is that, yes, on average, we see this favela effect, what might be a bit against the reduced inequalities and the inclusive cities in the sustainable development goals. But interestingly, some firms manage to overcome this failure and to be treating these consumers more evenly, even though there are like challenges to overcome the potential institutional failures from favelas.